Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming out to the last session of our genealogy day today. My name is Deborah Dudak. I'm the Adult and Teen Services Manager here at the Fountaindale Public Library in Bolingbrook, Illinois. To all of our friends and relations and acquaintances, both here and from what I've been told in Canada, hello. We're very happy that you all are here today. So the last speaker that we have and our keynote speaker for the day is Dr. Daniel Hubbard. He is amazing from the fact that when I called him and said, we need this really, really great program you don't give to anybody else because we don't like to double dip in what other great organizations are doing, he says, oh, I got the perfect one for you, and it involves murderers. Well, I can't say no to that. So I hope that you all get a lot about this research. It talks about the time before Civil War, progressing forward, a lot of really great resources told in a form that I hope you all will enjoy and will keep you awake after the wonderful luncheon that we all just had. So if you all will please give Daniel a warm round of applause. We deeply appreciate it.
Thank you. So, several of Luman Putnam's diaries from the late 1870s are missing. But his diary from 1879 still exists, and it doesn't mention Theodore and Esther Kenyon not even once. And that's pretty strange, because he mentioned them over and over and over again earlier in the decade. In 1880, in March, he has a diary entry in which he says he sent a letter to Esther in Cawker City, Kansas. And that's a long way away from where Esther and Theodore had been living in north central Pennsylvania, which is where Luman was still living. You'd think that if they were near Cawker City, Kansas in March of 1880, there's a census about to be taken, so we know where to look for them a few months later, but they aren't there. In fact, they aren't anywhere. They aren't enumerated in the 1880 census. 5 years later, when Kansas took a state census, there they were, a few miles to the west. Significant, but not all that far. Normally, one missing census entry and a short move in the space of 5 years, no big deal. But this isn't going to be normal, and that's why that little house in the prairie thing is a total lie. You can look at this talk in several ways. One is as a case study in reconstructing people's lives and the events that touch those lives using a variety of records. You should be able to see examples of all of these things during this talk, and it's the tip of the iceberg because there was a lot more that went into this. You can also look at it as a case study in using narrative to extend your research. I assume everybody in here gathers data, and I hope everyone in here analyzes it once they've got some. If you get enough, and this doesn't work with every ancestor, pull it into a narrative. There are a lot of reasons to do that. One, like this, has nothing to do with research per se, but it's true that if you've got experience trying to explain this stuff to relatives, they're going to enjoy stories more than a manila folder full of will Xeroxes. You can think of this as a research tool, though. It can help you spot inconsistencies. If you have trouble writing a narrative, it may not be that your writing is the problem. It may be that it doesn't flow because there's an inconsistency in your research and you're discovering it. Sometimes your research is perfectly consistent, but you might notice that there are holes, time periods when you realize you just don't know what was happening with these people, or a certain facet of a person's life that you know everything else about them quite well, and yet this one area you don't know anything. I think the big thing, though, is that when you take off your researcher hat and put on your writer hat, you're looking at your data from a totally different viewpoint. And that means that you're sort of the proofreader. You get to be almost a different person and see things in a different light and hopefully come up with some new hypotheses that bring you back to gathering and analyzing data. We can also look at this as a case study in the fact that laws matter in genealogy. The law tells us what our ancestors were supposed to do. Therefore, it also tells us what they're going to try to weasel out of. And it tells us, at least hints, as how they might attempt to do that weaseling. The story that got me started on this is fairly simple. When Frank Knox's son was about 18 months old, Frank got into a fight with a neighbor over a fence. Fight got out of hand, the neighbor died. Frank goes to prison, his wife gets a divorce. That's a version of a story that was told to me by a client who wanted me to research this, among other things. And it sounds simple enough, right? You can almost see it. Frank's out looking over his farm. He discovers in the distance his neighbor is working. He goes over and he thinks the neighbor's putting up a fence on the wrong side of the property line. Things get heated. The neighbor takes a swing at him. He takes a swing back, but he's got a shovel or something in his hand. The blade of the shovel catches the neighbor in the side of the head. He drops. Frank's horrified, but he ends up going to prison. Now, that's one possibility, of course, but it's not quite what happened. The law that I hinted that we're going to need to look at is the Homestead Act of 1862. And we were just hearing about war, and 1862 might ring a bell with you, and you might think that's an awfully odd time to be passing major legislation that has nothing whatsoever to do with the military. But if you think about what the Homestead Act was, it was a way of encouraging the settlement of the West by small farmers. If you've got half the government dominated by a slave-holding, plantation-owning aristocracy, the last thing they want is a West full of small farms and small farmers. So this legislation went nowhere until that slave-owning aristocracy removed itself from the government, and then it passed quite easily. So let's see what's in there. I've highlighted in the next few slides the important parts in red. Some of it's general, some of it's important to our story. First off, basically anybody could claim a homestead. You had to be head of a family or over the age of 21. There were other requirements, but we don't need to get into those. You were claiming 1/4 section or less of land. And if you don't know what a quarter section is, don't worry, we'll cover that in just a moment. But of course, there are caveats with this. If you already owned a piece of land, you could, in principle, claim a homestead adjacent to that land, but only if the sum of the area of the land that you were claiming plus the land that you owned was 160 acres or less. If it was more than that, forget about it. You also had to do this to actually settle the land. This wasn't an act to support land speculators. This was an act to encourage small farmers. How do you make sure that people are really serious? You require them to live on the land for 5 years and make improvements on that land. Things like building a home, building barns, outbuildings, putting up fences, breaking the sod, that sort of thing. What would happen if you didn't spend that full 5 years? If you left the land for more than 6 months, your claim was declared invalid and the land reverted to the government. Something like this is going to produce a lot of paperwork, and of course, we genealogists love our paperwork because it gives us stuff to look at and information about our ancestors. I want to show you some example paperwork. This is the paperwork for a sort of a minor celebrity in Homestead Act circles. It's Daniel Freeman who filed claim number 1. So here you can see this sheet is pre-printed, and that helps us see things more explicitly than what's in the act itself, because some of the pre-printed stuff is things like built a house. That was pre-printed on the form. That was assumed. You built a house. You were there to farm. All of that sort of thing is pre-printed on this. Here's an affidavit where Daniel said that his claim was for his benefit and his benefit alone. Remember, land speculation was a worry. Here's an affidavit from some neighbors saying that he really was a resident of this land for 5 years. He really did make improvements. He was a bona fide settler. So that's a sample of the paperwork that would need to be filed. What were they actually claiming? To understand that, we've got to spend one slide on the public land survey system, which is how most of the United States, especially away from the East Coast, was surveyed. The general idea is the entire country was divided up into 6 by 6 mile squares. Those squares are confusingly called townships. Now, once you survey out the boundaries of the township, then you chop the thing up into 1 mile by 1 mile squares. You get 36 of those. Those squares are called sections. And then you can start chopping things in half. They usually did things in half. If you chop in half along a north-south line and along an east-west line, the result is a quarter section. So that's what claimants were allowed to claim. There is one nuance with this. And the nuance is you can't cover the spherical Earth with perfect squares. It simply doesn't work. There are several ways that that was corrected for. We're going to talk about the one that's important to this story, which is this line was run north-south. This line was run north-south. On a flat surface, that's fine. On a curved Earth, that means those lines actually meet at the poles, which means that that thing isn't really a square. So you start your survey in the southeast corner. Once you've got the township boundaries laid out, you just work your way out, marking out the sections. And that means that any survey errors, and there were always errors, these are guys with chains over hills, so all the survey errors are going to end up in the northernmost and westernmost quarter sections. And all the problems caused by the Earth being a sphere end up in the westernmost quarter sections. That makes those quarter sections smaller than they should be. They should be 160 acres. But these are going to end up being 150, 140 acres. So if you were paying for the land outright and that was okay with you, that would be fine because you're paying by the acre. But these were people claiming land that was basically free. Why claim a quarter section that was smaller than what you were in principle entitled to? So those westernmost quarter sections often remained unclaimed extra long. So even after all of this was claimed and all the neighboring land to the west was claimed, still available. So now we've got to get a family from the east out to Kansas. Like a lot of stories about real people, we've got to have a bit of a preamble here because people lead complex lives with complex motivations. And to understand what happens, you need to understand what happened before it. I first ran into her going through a client's box of old stuff. There were 2 pieces of sort of dirty-looking, cloudy, broken glass at the bottom. It looked like they fit together, and it made me suspicious. So I put them over a black background, put them into a scanner, did some photo enhancement, and there she was. What I was suspicious of was that those pieces of glass were a thing called an ambrotype. It's a kind of photograph that had its heyday in the 1850s. Before that, it didn't exist. After that, it was generally replaced with tintypes. So I had a reasonable date for this, but I had no idea who she was. But as I researched the client's family, started to eliminate possibilities, started to look at other photographs and figure out exactly who they were, I realized she was Harriet Kenyon. So here's Harriet. I think it's her wedding picture because the man next to her is her husband, George Bailey. They were married in 1859. And there are a couple reasons why I'm pretty sure this is their wedding picture. For one, these people couldn't afford those clothes. Those were probably owned by the photo gallery where they had them taken, so this was a very special photograph. Also, they're sort of conspicuously showing off their wedding rings. And you might look at him and say, that's the wrong hand, but this is old technology, it's mirror imaged, so that's the correct hand. The other thing is, there really wasn't all that much time for a formal picture of this couple to be taken. Remember, they were married in 1859. George went into the Army in 1861. He spent 4 years in the Army, survived some minor combat, and repeated bouts of malaria, only to be taken captive outside the defenses of Richmond when the war was nearly over. He was sent south to Salisbury Prison in North Carolina, where he starved to death within a month of his arrival. I found this in, I think it was a different box of old stuff, but that's what it was. And this is a memorial brooch. It's a kind that was made popular by Queen Victoria when Prince Albert died in 1861, and it didn't remain popular past the 1860s, so that gives me a date for it. Looks like other pictures of George Bailey that I've got. If you notice, it looks a bit skewed. That's because this type of brooch has a pair of pins, one from above, one from below, so that the center part can rotate. And if it's true to form, the brown weave that's on the back of this, that you can see when you rotate it, was made from a lock of George's hair, presumably one that Harriet saved when he went into the Army. So he's now one of about 12,000 men who died at Salisbury Prison, who were simply dumped into mass graves where they still are. The other thing I want to show you comes from George's pension file. Now you might think, wait a minute, he died, how did he get a pension? Well, he didn't, but his widow was entitled to one. So this is Harriet's application for a widow's pension. At the bottom are two signatures for the witnesses. One is Theodore Kenyon, her brother. The other is Avery Kenyon, her father. Harriet had several brothers who served in the war, and one of them wrote her a letter that is really interesting for sociological reasons, so I want to show it to you, because the point it makes is important in a moment. He said, "Well, Harriet, the war is over at last, but it has cost you dear. You have lost a dear husband, and you are left to mourn his loss. But you are not the only one. With you are 1,000 more." Now, aside from some grammar and spelling irregularities, there's a huge underestimate here, of course. She wasn't one of 1,000 war widows. She was one of hundreds of thousands of war widows, young women without really an opportunity to remarry. Because, of course, there was a reason there were so many war widows. It's because there were so few young men left. This was in an age when, if you were a young adult, you were expected to be married. And if you were a young adult with children, and Harriet had children, you really needed to be married. It didn't matter whether you were male or female. Raising a family as a single parent was simply not realistic and not socially accepted particularly well either. In the West, it was a different story, though. In the West, the frontier, there were more men than there were women, so it wasn't unusual at this time for women in the East to advertise in newspapers in the West, men in the West to advertise in newspapers in the East. Looking for a spouse. We think online dating is new, but it's only the online aspect of it that's really different. So I have looked for, but never found, the newspaper ad that I am pretty sure must have appeared at one end or the other of this exchange that led Harriet to Kansas. She married a man named Amos Kendall in Tonganoxie, Kansas in April of 1870, officially. Because I've read lots of letters written to Amos before that date, and to Harriet before that date. And they're different. Harriet's letters, to the extent they mention these things at all, always say things like, how are you ever going to find a husband out there? What are you doing out there? Are the Injuns going to capture you? Amos's letters say things like this: Jenny wants to see your little fellows and wonders when we get to meet your wife. That was written in March of 1868. As far as I know, Amos Kendall had no wife before Harriet. Also, he was a Civil War veteran himself, so he had spent a long time in the Army, in fact, longer than normal. He had gotten out not all that long before this, because he had been in the occupation forces in Texas. So where did he find the time to have little fellows? Doesn't make a lot of sense, except that Harriet had 2 sons, which possibly accounts for the wife and the little fellows. There are exceptions among those letters to Harriet, and I realized at some point they all come from the same place. It's always the family of her sister Fanny. Harriet and Fanny, early in the war, I can tell from letters that Harriet wrote to George, didn't get along all that well. Fanny was 10 years older, and you can imagine growing up with sisters who were 10 years apart, they aren't necessarily going to see eye to eye. But something changed. They started getting along much better, and I think the reason is this. They had a very powerful shared experience. Fanny was a war widow as well. In fact, Harriet's husband, George, had watched Fanny's husband die. So I think there's a bit of maturing, and there's this common aspect to their lives that allowed Harriet to confess things to Fanny that she couldn't tell to anyone else, things that were outside the social norms. Here's one letter to Harriet from that family. It says Bubby Candle. Now, the spelling and grammar in all of these letters is pretty bizarre, but I can't come up with any meaning for that except for baby Kendall. And that was written in August of 1868. Fanny's 11-year-old daughter Polly was more explicit. She wrote her Aunt Harriet as Harriet Bailey Kendall in October of 1869, long before she was married. So I have a feeling somebody answered someone's newspaper ad, Harriet went west, and they considered themselves to be husband and wife from that moment forward, even though they weren't actually married for several years. So that gives us the background to start to understand the rest of this story. Harriet is going to reappear, so you need to understand her, but also we're going to be looking at a chain migration, and Harriet is the person who's responsible for starting that. A chain migration is when one person heads off, and that sets off a movement among their family, possibly among neighbors, everyone moving one after the other to join them in this new place that seems like a nice place to be. So as we get into the main story, I'm going to have to introduce it as 3 separate paths and then bring it together. Path number 1 has to do with that chain migration. It's her brother Theodore. Theodore was a photographer, at least as early as 1864, and you can see that from Civil War tax records. There he is listed in Chester, New York, as a photographer. A year later, the 1865 tax records list him as a photographer in Shroon, New York. Excuse me. Shroon is a much more important town for this story, because Shroon is where the Kenyon family, at least their branch of it, was actually centered, and we're going to get back to Shroon. Esther's uncle Luman wrote this in his diary in early March of 1868. Harriet and Theodore didn't live anywhere nearby at that point. Esther and Theodore didn't live anywhere nearby at that point, but they had come to visit because Esther's mother lived nearby. But now They were on their way to Elmira, where they were going to catch the train for Kansas. Now, notice this is early March. The first evidence for Harriet and Amos being together is late March of the same year. It's possible that they were going to Elmira to meet Harriet's train. It's a logical path for both of them. Maybe Harriet was already in Kansas, I don't know. But I do know that Theodore and Esther did, in fact, end up with Harriet in Kansas because a friend of Amos wrote him after a visit and wanted Amos to give his respects to Theodore, Mrs. Kenyon, and to Harriet.
Didn't they have excursion trains at that point where, you bought a ticket on the train and they took you around to the area to view property?
That could be, yeah. So now we know that Theodore and Esther are in Tonganoxie with Amos. And in fact, there's a PS in that letter that even tells us something more. The PS asks about the arrival of a bottle of collodion, which probably means nothing to most of us, but it meant a lot in the mid-19th century because collodion was a substance you needed if you were going to produce tintypes or glass plate negatives. So why would somebody be sending a bottle of collodion to Amos, who was a farmer? Because Theodore, who was a photographer, was there. So maybe Theodore meant to stay and start a photography business. Maybe he was only trying to work a little bit while he had an extended stay there. We don't know, but we do know that he went back. Luhmann wrote in his diary, April 1st, 1870, that when he went to go visit his sister for New Year's Day, Theodore and Esther were there. So sometime in between June 1869 and January 1870, they went back to the east and settled in northern Pennsylvania. Path number 2 is the Knox family. This is the 1870 census. It shows Rodney Knox and his family in Lawrence, Kansas. 1871, Rodney bought a farm further west in Osborne County, and sure enough, the 1875 state census shows him there. The farm he bought was 200 acres. I know where it was, so we can look at it on a plat map. And in fact, even though his name isn't on this map, it was made too recently, if we know where to look, which was where the Solomon River left Ross Township and entered Mitchell County, we can actually see the outline of his land. He had a quarter section, but he also had a little bit extra. There's a tail on that piece of land. Remember I said once they had the sections, they would just divide things in half and half and half and half over and over if they wanted to. So he had a quarter section plus a quarter of the neighboring quarter section. 160 acres plus a quarter is 40, that's 200. So I think even though this plat map is a bit too recent, we can actually see the outline of Rodney's farm. Rodney apparently meant to make his fortune ranching. The Osborne County Farmer, a local newspaper, even mentioned him as the raiser of thoroughbred stock in 1880. And we can see from the 1880 agricultural census that Rodney produced 650 lambs. So he was getting into sheep, and that's a lot of lambs to produce. He had more sheep, produced more lambs, more equipment than any of his neighbors. He also had more land than any of his neighbors, 350 acres. But I just said he had 200. And in fact, he didn't actually own all of that land. If we look next door at Mitchell County, there's the Solomon River flowing in. Rodney had a homestead claim there. Now, those quarter sections are small. In fact, that one's 146, so adding that to his 200 and rounding up gives you the 350. But didn't the Homestead Act say there was a 160-acre limit? It does, and this is contiguous with his land, so Rodney's got a problem. In fact, Rodney's got two problems because that 1880 agricultural census and the population schedule both show him living in Osborne County, and he needs to live on that claim in order to be able to make the claim stick, and he wasn't living there. You can understand why. He had a farm. He may have bought it already partially developed. He may have done the work himself, but certainly by 1880, for a farm bought in 1871, he had a home, he had barns and outbuildings. You don't have that many sheep without having some outbuildings for them. Fences, a kitchen garden, all of those things that help make life on the plains a bit more comfortable. So why would he live on his claim? Well, it would have helped make it legitimate, but he didn't. So now he's got two problems. There's his claim right there. There's a thing called a tract book. These document how a piece of land was transferred from federal hands into private hands. So you have to look up things by the tract. And here's the tract book entry for Rodney's claim. There's a lot going on here. In fact, there is far too much going on here, but we'll get into that. The important thing is he made this claim in 1873, which means that his 5 years would have been up in 1878 if he had played everything right. But of course, he didn't. Path number 3 is Henry Kuchell. He was a German immigrant who came to the area around 1873, and when he realized that a certain local land claim didn't look quite legitimate, he did what a lot of people at the time did. He filed papers to claim that land. He found a spot in the riverbank, and he dug in. And that's, in fact, exactly what this thing is. It's a dugout. This is a contemporary illustration of one. You would find a slope. You would dig in horizontally, sort of making an artificial cave. You'd use a little wood, and of course that was a limited resource in the plains, to wall off that opening, run a chimney through the top, and voila. Not perhaps luxury, but well insulated for the winter and cool in the summer. Certainly beats the great outdoors. So now we need to bring our 3 paths together. And I bet you can smell one of them coming. In 1881, the Osborne County farmer harked back to the early days of the county, 3 years before. Okay, this is the frontier. 3 years means a lot to them. December 18th, 1878, this is what they wrote. The contest of Henry Kuchell versus R.W. Knox is pending. So now we've got those two brought together. Bringing Theodore in is going to take a little bit more work. Remember, Luman Putnam wrote in his diary in March of 1880 that Theodore and Esther were living, presumably, in the area of Cawker City, Kansas. And that's the township in Mitchell County where the contested claim was. Now, like I said, Luman didn't mention them at all earlier in the year. He didn't mention them in 1879, and Luman mentioned them a lot before then. He visited Theodore's photography studio sometimes 3 times a day. If I was Theodore, I would have moved hundreds of miles away as well, because I think Uncle Luman was a little bit over the top. So they weren't anywhere near him in 1879. And you don't necessarily want to travel during the winter, so they were probably somewhere around Cawker City already in the fall of 1878. And that's exactly when the contest between Kuchell and Knox was documented. Coincidence? Probably not. So here is Avery Kenyon, that's Theodore and Harriet's father. Sitting next to him is Allen Kenyon. Remember I said Harriet set off a chain migration. Her uncle Allen is one of the people who headed to Kansas. He settled in Osborne County in the early 1870s. By 1880, perhaps earlier, he had a farmhand named Charlie Knox, Rodney's son. So it's just possible that from Charlie, Allen learned of a certain opportunity waiting for someone who might want to make improvements on the land, build a home, make a claim look legitimate, and perhaps hide from a census enumerator or two. That could be how Theodore found out about a farm that he could have free use of in Kansas. He might have found out otherwise, though. Back in the 1860s, when George Bailey was still alive and in the war, he and Harriet exchanged lots of letters. Those letters often discuss people with the surname Knox. One of them was a guy in George's unit named Martin Van Buren Knox, who George really didn't like. Harriet had a brother in the same unit. George didn't like him either. They seemed, the two of them, Harriet's brother and Martin Knox, seemed to be having a couple of contests. One, who could give George the hardest time? And two, who could get promoted the fastest by sucking up to as many officers as possible? George didn't really like either of those activities. In fact, in one letter to Harriet, he referred to Harriet's brother using a term I couldn't really read, and eventually I read buckhouse wiper. And buckhouse got me thinking, and his spelling wasn't the greatest. That could be backhouse, and sure enough, Adirondack slang from the mid-19th centuries, that was an outhouse. Wonder what George was accusing Harriet's brother of wiping. And Martin was lower on the scale, so those two didn't get along at all. There was also an Uncle Jeft. Once, and only once, did Harriet give his surname, and it was Knox. If we look at the 1850 census of Shroon, we find Jephthah Knox. Other records of this man make it clear the enumerator put the H in the wrong spot. It isn't Jephthah, it's Jephthah. This is Harriet's Uncle Jeft. And right there, as a 19-year-old, is Rodney. So the Kenyon and Knox families were kin. And it's probably important to remember that because I think it explains some of Theodore's behavior later. So now that we've brought everything together, we need to get into a little exchange of pleasantries. This was a note sent to Frank Jones in 1879. I have the honor to address you. Well, that's nice. You nefarious, barefaced, shameless thief who's out to get my friend Knox. Warning, euphemism ahead. Sever your connection with the affairs of this earth. Wonder what that could mean, you unprincipled dog. Now we're going to drop euphemisms and just say, better men than you have been shot. I will do my duty. And that little missive was sent by that famous man of letters, Mr. No More Words. After this and other death threats that don't survive, Kuchell and Knox reached an agreement, and Kuchell decided it was a good idea to leave. So Kuchell went to Colorado in 1880. After that, in September of that year, Katie Kenyon, remember I said this was a chain migration and I meant it. This is Theodore's cousin Katie, married Charlie Knox. This is their son Frank, and if that sounds familiar to you, it's because that's the name from the story that started all this. So our family stories, they often contain good info, but they sometimes scramble it a bit. Frank wasn't the father, Frank was the son, and there he is. And spoiler alert, that is not Charlie Knox sitting next to Katie Kenyon. If we go back to the Federal Tract book, we see something, and unfortunately they don't tell us what, got canceled in September of 1880. That might have meant that Kuchell had been away too long, so they canceled his claim. Possible. But there was a hearing at the Federal Land Office in Kerwin, Kansas in September of 1880, and it involved the Kuchell-Knox claim. There were some witnesses for Henry that showed up. Frank Jones, the man who received that first death threat, and a few other names that are going to come up later. Joe Layton, the Hull brothers, and John Blunt. Knox had some witnesses show up too, but they weren't exactly the unbiased types that you would want. because it was the rest of his family that testified in his favor. Oh, and one guy who was getting free use of his farm, Theodore Kenyon. This hearing ruled for Henry Kuchell, so Henry decided to come back. And in Rodney's own words, Theodore came to him one day and said that someone had, quote, commenced to make improvements on the land. So there's two things here. One is improvements. That's a key phrase from the homestead paperwork. That's what you do if you're trying to get your hands on a claim. And the other thing is, wouldn't this be a bit creepy? Think about it. You're Theodore, you're out riding around or walking around this farm that you're trying to get going, and all of a sudden you realize there's work that you can see having been done that you didn't do and have no idea how it quite happened. Sort of like opening the curtains in the morning and seeing a tool shed outside your bedroom window that you didn't put there. But we can guess who did it, and sure enough, eventually Theodore reported that Kuchell had started to build a house, another key thing from the Homestead Act. Also, perhaps important, he said that threats passed between them. And with Kuchell back, it's time for some more pleasantries, this time to Joe Layton, another one of his witnesses. It's a nice little informative note that you thieving rascal, you will suffer consequences more severe than the loss of a homestead. No further warnings. Oh, and by the way, you're outnumbered, because I'm writing this as one of 10. Notice where these death threats are coming from. The last one also came from Lawrence, Kansas. Remember, that's where Rodney had been living 10 years earlier. So did he have friends in Lawrence who were mailing these for him so that it didn't look like they were coming from too nearby? Was Rodney going to visit people with letters in his pocket that he could just dole out and have them take them to the post office? I don't know, but it doesn't seem like a coincidence. So if we've got threats, we need to have a plot. And the events of the night of March 14th, 1881 were long in preparation, but it all unraveled pretty quickly. Sometime during that winter, Knox, Rodney that is, and Theodore went to see John Blunt to discuss further compromise. After talking to him, they went to see Kuchell. When they left, Theodore told Knox that he thought the offer that he had made was a good one. But then he asked, if he takes that offer, what's going to happen to me? And Rodney said, I'll make that okay with you. A little more thought, if he does not take your offer, what are we going to do about that then? We'll make it right with you. We'll try to get him off the land, was the response. Theodore said, without really knowing what he was saying, I'll help you all I can. Knox told Theodore that he thought Theodore was afraid of the law. Theodore said that he was no more afraid than Rodney was. And then he asked, how are we going to get him off the place? And this is the response he got. Well, we could shoot him or we could blow him up. How much gunpowder would it take to blow up that dugout, do you think? Why Theodore was the right person to answer that question, I don't know, but he did, and he said about 5 pounds. Ooh. So then Rodney said, I'll buy the powder if you'll be the one to put it in. And then he said, oh, by the way, don't mention this conversation to anyone. Gee, I wonder why. So the next time that Rodney and Theodore spoke about this, they knew that Kuchell had turned down the offer. So Rodney did some thinking and he said this, you know, just dropping a bomb, that doesn't sound like enough. What if he survives the bomb? We'd better have somebody waiting by to shoot him, just in case. And that's when Mrs. Kuchell interjected that she could no longer live with that German rat on the place, so she was a charmer too. At some point during this research, I started to wonder, why Theodore? because if you're Knox, wouldn't you rather bring in some totally outside person to do what you seem to be talking about? Why somebody who's so closely connected to you? So Theodore seems like a bad choice, but when I thought about it, Rodney, of course, couldn't do this himself. He needed an alibi. And in fact, if Kuchell had been eaten by a bear, Rodney would have been the main suspect. So maybe Rodney needed somebody he could frame, not just an alibi. And who knew the land as well as he did? And who knew the dugout as well as Rodney did? And who had reason to dislike Kuchell almost as much as Rodney did? And who stood to lose almost as much as Kuchell, if Kuchell won, as Rodney did? Well, that person, of course, could be framed, and that person was Theodore Kenyon. Theodore had some qualms about all of this, and Knox now had a plot that required 2 people. And Theodore was looking less and less like one of them. But of course, if I'm right, it's absolutely necessary for Theodore to have been at the scene when the crime took place. So here's what Rodney asked him. Do you think it worse morally to shoot a man or to blow him up? Well, there's a loaded question. What do you answer to that? No. But that's also a bit of a trap, because then the logical response is, well, then why don't we just shoot him and get the whole thing over with? Theodore just said he didn't like the idea of killing. So if you're planning something like this, you need to do some spying, because now the clock is ticking. 2.5 weeks before the conclusion of the story, Charlie went to see Theodore and said, I think the 2 of us need to go down and check on Kuchell tonight. Charlie may have gone, I don't know, but Theodore never showed up. So a couple of days later, Charlie went to talk to Theodore again and said, we really need to go. And Theodore said, yeah, I know, but the weather wasn't nice that night. Okay, let's go tonight. So they went. They stood outside the dugout and they watched Kuchell through his window. After watching for a little while, they moved away, and then Theodore said, it looks like Kuchell intends to meet the requirements of the law until he gets title to the land. Doesn't say it, but if that's not talking about the Homestead Act, I don't know what is. Charlie responded, we just need to get him off. Theodore still doesn't like shooting people or blowing them up. So Charlie said, I don't ask you to. You go with me, and I'll do the shooting. Why does a guy who's planning to murder someone need somebody to hold his hand? He needs Theodore to be there so that Theodore can be framed. A few days later, Charlie told Theodore he had bought saltpeter, which is the main active ingredient in gunpowder. So Theodore asked if that's what we were talking about here. And sure enough, Charlie answered, yes, it was. Theodore wanted to know how much. Charlie said that he had bought 2 pounds at one place, 1 pound at another, and another pound at a third, spreading out the purchases, apparently, so that it didn't look too suspicious. Somebody, and no one knows who, took a thing called a wagon thimble and filled it with gunpowder. Now, a wagon thimble is a cast iron cone, hollow so that it can fit over the end of a wagon axle. They took a spare one, and now that spare one was a bomb. Theodore had some qualms about this, and that same day he found out about the gunpowder, he went to tell his wife that he thought the Knoxes meant mischief. Really? He then went to see Charlie and found him down by the riverbank and said he didn't want to have anything to do with this anymore. And Charlie said, oh, Dad is going to fix it up for you nice. You not only get the land south of the river, you get the whole claim north of the river until all of this is over. Theodore said, I don't want that anymore. Charlie said he'd do it by himself. Theodore tried to tell him not to do anything along those lines. Charlie asked if Theodore would squeal on him. And Theodore said, "No, I won't do anything to hurt you. Remember, these two men are kin. They're blood relatives, and Charlie is married to Theodore's cousin." Leander Soules was Rodney Knox's on-again, off-again farmhand. He got fired March 1st, 1881. He got rehired about a week later. And Theodore knew Soules, but had never talked to him about Kuchell, so he went to Charlie and asked, isn't it a bit odd that your father fired this guy and then hired him back a week later? What's he here to do? And the answer was, chores, I suppose. For his part, Rodney Knox thought that Kuchell was out to get him too. He reported that one day, probably in the fall of 1880, he heard a snap and then nothing. He thought about it for a moment and ran over to the riverbank where he saw footprints. What Rodney was talking about is this kind of a weapon. It's called a cap lock. You put a percussion cap over that little tube. It makes a nice snapping explosion when the hammer comes down, and some of that goes into the main part of the barrel of the gun and sets off the main powder charge. He heard the snap. He didn't hear the gun go off, which meant the gun was now fouled and couldn't be used again until it was cleaned, so he knew it was safe to chase him. John Blunt later testified that the only thing that Kuchell had for his defense was the thing he had mounted above the door to the dugout, a thing that we associate with death in the form of the reaper, a scythe. The sensational story that came out of Cawker City, Kansas was picked up by papers all over the country. The Chicago Tribune referred to it as the deed of demons. The St. Paul Globe got it a bit wrong. They thought the murder was in Texas, not Kansas, but they got the rest of it right. Henry Kuchell was found brutally murdered in the morning of Tuesday, March 15th, 1881. He had been murdered the night before, a night when modern calculation shows that the moon was just hours away from being full, giving plenty of light to some people who might need to roam the night and see what was happening. The reporter that wrote this article here on the right was actually an eyewitness to what happened the following morning. So they went out and they found a murdered body near Jackson's Mill. And if we look at this close-up of the plat map, this name here, Mary Reese, that comes later. We'll talk about her actually, but this is where the Knox Kuchell claim was. But look next door, the Jackson brothers, there's a mill labeled. So Kuchell had been running this way. They found the body of Henry Kuchell lying on the road, his head in a pool of clotted blood, brains oozing out the back. They found broken bits of a shotgun scattered around the body. From there, they went over to Kuchell's dugout to see what was there. They found the door blown 15 feet off of the hinges. Everything inside was utter chaos. They figured out pretty quickly that somebody had dropped a bomb down the stovepipe and shattered Kuchell's cast iron stove into hundreds of pieces. There were fresh hack marks around the doorway, and you can really tell the difference after an explosion because nothing else is going to look fresh. Those hack marks told them that Kuchell had burst out, both terrified and terrifying, swinging that scythe. There was a panicked shotgun blast. It missed him, hit the back of the dugout. Kuchell somehow broke free, apparently wounding at least one person, and ran down the road, only to be shot in the back. And when they discovered he was still alive, they used the murder weapon to beat him to death. The county attorney arrived Wednesday morning and started questioning people. He didn't stop until the following Thursday. At that point, Rodney Knox, Charlie Knox, Leander Soules, and Theodore Kenyon were brought in under arrest. The Cawker City Free Press published little sketches of the arrested men. Rodney got the biggest one and doesn't come out looking extremely good. Peculiar whims and extreme egotism. His son, it's sort of ambiguous. I can't tell reading that, is that the description of a terrified young man, or is it the description of a psychopath? I don't know. Leander Soules didn't get much written about him, except that he was freshly bruised, freshly wounded, and had fresh, supposed sheep's blood on his hat. Theodore, they wrote almost nothing. They wrote that he was under the indirect employ of R.W. Knox and lived on the Knox-Kuchell homestead. Most of what we know about this murder comes from the physical evidence and Theodore's extensive testimony. But there were other people who came in. Several people reported seeing Charlie Knox with a shotgun about a month before that looked a lot like it matched those broken bits found in the road. There were other people who reported interesting quotes from Rodney from 3 years earlier. One or the other of us must die, and I have a good shotgun and would use it, are fairly clear. Another witness had what might even be the most damning testimony, even if it was short. He had spent the evening with the Hull brothers. Remember them? They were witnesses at the land hearing. And who should come for a visit but Charlie Knox and Leander Soules, and my, weren't they behaving deeply strangely? They stayed for about 2 hours and then left, and the other men agreed that this was really weird, went out and checked the following morning to see that Kuchell was okay, and became the men who found the murder victim. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have been found so quickly. The arrested men, which now consisted of the two Knoxes and Soules, not Theodore Kenyon, were moved to progressively farther jails from Mitchell County. And the reason probably is that it wasn't unknown at the time for vigilantes to break down jails, to grab the people inside, drag them out and lynch them. And in fact, the Downs Kansas Times reported that many good citizens felt it would be unhealthy for those men to appear nearby. So they're sort of hinting that that's what was going on. Theodore, even though he wasn't under arrest for murder anymore, was out on bond as the main witness for the prosecution. And another local paper thought that, you know, if we had forgotten to report a murderous plot until after we were arrested, maybe, just maybe, once we could legally do it, we would get to Indian Territory as fast as possible. Which also sounds like something of a threat. Charlie Knox, for reasons never stated, was tried on his own. The verdict was murder in the second degree, and there was general dissatisfaction. The reason is because murder in the second degree generally means non-premeditated murder. How on earth did they make a bomb and deploy it in the middle of the night in a non-premeditated way? No one in the audience could understand that, but that was what the ruling was. The other problem is that he could only have gotten 10 years for second-degree murder. Turned out he got 15. He was reported as, quote unquote, digging coal for the state in 1883, and then he disappears. He's said to have never set foot in the Solomon Valley again, and I know nothing more about him. He seems to simply vanish. He did get to visit his wife, though, before he went to prison. Notice they don't really say much about her. They don't say that she was the cousin of the chief witness for the prosecution. It doesn't say that she was pregnant with their only child. In fact, this was only 2 or 3 days before Frank was born, so she was on the verge of delivering. probably felt it was inappropriate to drag her name into it. In September of 1881, while Rodney was sitting in the Jewell County Jail waiting for trial, the Secretary of the Interior ruled in his favor in the homestead claim decision, obviously somewhat unaware of certain events further west. So Rodney went to trial after that. He claimed innocence but pled guilty. He was also convicted, bizarrely, of second-degree murder, but he was sentenced to 25 years. And people in the audience thought, well, that's okay. He's an older man. 25 years gives him plenty of time to both rot in jail and actually die in jail. And that's what they figured he deserved. His final statements, he claimed that the only reason he pled guilty was because his thieving lawyers were overcharging him. And he also claimed that Theodore was far more guilty than he was, but he never actually said why. The audience thought that this guy isn't just guilty, he's exceedingly guilty. So he got what he deserved. That brings us back to this piece of land, because in May of 1882, a Mrs. Ludlow from Indiana bought the former homestead. Not long after that, she married her husband's former overseer, a Mr. Lewis Reese, which is why her name is Reese on this plat map. Interestingly, she seems to have still been married to Mr. Ludlow, who was still of Indiana at the time. Thank you. The year after that, William Cutler published his History of the State of Kansas, and he actually wrote about Rodney. He talked glowingly of Rodney's good works in many area churches and Sunday schools, and then added at the bottom, now of the government works in Leavenworth, without actually saying in what capacity he was there. The Land Tract book shows us that Henry Kuchell's claim to the land was officially terminated in October of 1881, which makes a lot of sense since he'd been dead for 5 months at that point. It also shows us how it was that Mrs. Ludlow could have bought that land, because she bought it from Knox. The answer is he had bought the land in 1881 while he was awaiting trial, because you see, there's no reason why a failed homestead claimant can't simply pay the price set by pre-Homestead Act legislation and buy the land outright, which he could have done at any time. He paid $182.86 for it, which tells us how much he valued Henry Kuchell's life. Leander Soules also claimed innocence but pled guilty. Even perhaps more bizarrely than the other rulings, he was only convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to 3 years. He confessed twice after that. Of course, they differ. And once he said that Rodney had bossed the job. Well, that's a surprise to absolutely no one. He said that Theodore had dropped the bomb, and he said that he had been the one who fired that first shot that missed Kuchell and hit the back of the dugout, and that Charlie had been the one to do the actual shooting and bludgeoning. His second confession, he said, oh wait, no, I was the one who dropped the bomb. It stunned me, and I didn't really come to until Charlie was already beating Kuchell to death. He got out on good behavior after 2 years, moved to St. Louis, got married, and ironically spent the rest of his days as a life insurance salesman. Yeah. Theodore Kenyon didn't take the paper's advice and flee to Indian Territory. He moved those few miles west that I mentioned at the beginning of this, settled down to the quiet life of a farmer, and was almost unheard of again. In 1895, he did move to Oklahoma Territory, which interestingly had been Indian Territory in the early 1880s. He's in the 1900 census there. And that's it. He just vanishes. The only further clue comes from his son's insurance application from 1905, in which he reports that both of his parents were deceased. As I was wrapping up, not just this, but the book that this was going into, my client said, I've got an old local history that my mom bought up on the shelf. Why don't you take a look through this, get some background on the little towns, the local characters, the lay of the land, that sort of thing, that you can mix in as you see fit. And I thought, well, that sounds like a fine idea. So she gave me that book. I got what she wanted, or thought was in there. I also got this. A young German named Kuchell found murdered near his dugout. A neighbor, Tom Kenton, was arrested, turned state's evidence. 4 men were responsible for the murder: Knox, his son Charlie, the hired man Souls, and Kenton, who dropped the bomb. You notice the only man who wasn't tried for this crime is the only man whose identity is getting protected here, because of course Tom Kenton is Theodore Kenyon. So this is yet another version of the story, and it's a story in which Theodore is guilty of at least attempted murder. What he really did, we'll probably never know. Thank you.
So do we have any questions from the audience today? Well, I know you all are very terribly overwhelmed, and I really do that. So for our webinar watchers, we wanted to thank you so much for coming out to the webinar today. Remember that you can go back anytime on our website, fountaindalegenealogy.org. Check out our webinar area, as well as sign up for any of the programs that we have available there as well. So we hope to see you back in September for our streaming World War I genealogy workshop, which is available very generously through a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and that will be available for 3 years because we want to help you find your World War I ancestors. So if everyone will give a lovely warm round of applause for Dr. Dan Hubbard.
Thank you.